Good morning, everybody. Good morning. And thank you for coming. It's terrific to see so many people here. I should introduce myself. I'm Tim's brother-in-law. Judith was my sister. And it's my job this morning just to let you know briefly what we're planning for the morning. Before that, you'll notice that there's a camera or a contraption over there. Many of Tim's friends from around the world very much wanted to be here, but the distances they had to travel made it impossible. So we've been able to set up a live stream there, thanks to the AV department of the RA. So we're being joined by friends of Tim's from all over the world, from the US, from Australia, India, Japan, and of course from people in the UK who, for whatever reason, couldn't make it. And so a very warm welcome to all of you as well who are watching on the live stream. What we're planning this morning is that rather than one person delivering a eulogy, several of Tim's friends and members of his family will each speak briefly about a particular aspect of his life and his work, so that hopefully that way we'll get several different perspectives on the sort of person that he was, and maybe a truer, deeper, more in the round sense of him, and maybe conjure him up for us all this morning. The first person who's going to speak is Rebecca Salter, the president of the RA, who's very kindly agreed to say a few words of welcome and of introduction. Rebecca.
Good morning and a very warm welcome to the Royal Academy and to those of you joining online. It's very fitting that we're here at the RA to celebrate the life of Tim Hyman, because in many ways he was a perfect Royal Academician and the RA was the perfect place for him. As an artist, he combined razor-sharp observation with a razor-sharp mind, a formidable combination. He was elected an academician in 2011, and in his relatively short time with us, he contributed a great deal to the life of the organisation. He sat on council, he hung the summer exhibition, but most notably, he served 6 years on our learning committee, helping to shape the Royal Academy's role in nurturing artists of the future. I have a very clear pre-COVID memory of Tim. He was holding an open studios event, and it was a biblically wet Saturday morning, and I went to his studio. And I will never forget standing in front of a wall of his drawings of London and quietly being drawn in by his love for and sharp observation of this great city. And in those quick sketches, he combined two of his defining characteristics, acuity and humanity. We will miss him greatly. I would now like to hand over to his sister and the novelist Miranda Miller.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? It's wonderful to see so many friends of Tim here today. And I want to thank you for all the warm messages of support and affection for Tim that you sent me after he died. When I was wondering what to say about Tim's childhood, I remembered those descriptions in Vasari of little boys who were intuitively and instinctively natural artists right from the beginning, who started drawing on stones and rocks. And Tim really was such a child, and his life was very consistent. We grew up in London, and there were 4 children. Nikki, the oldest, can't be with us today. Then there were the twins, Tim and Tony, who sadly died in 1999. I was 5 years younger, and my earliest memories of Tim are from when he was about 8 or 9. Our parents were hopeless with money, but they always encouraged their children's ambitions and fantasies. Tim told me later that as a child, he was convinced he was really a prince from Atlantis. And the royal family of Atlantis were going to come at any minute and rescue him. But they didn't turn up, so he was stuck with the rest of us. And as a child, his closest friend was his brother, his twin brother, Tony. They shared a room, and they were allies against the world, although they were very different, both physically and emotionally. And Tim was already collecting art postcards and art books, and whenever he could, he went to the Tate and the National Gallery and the Wallace Collection, dragging along Tony, who used to complain about having to look at all those naked fatties, as he called them. And at school, Tim was considered very talented. He adored the Tolkien books. And the first picture of his that I can remember seeing was a portrait of Gandalf done as a kind of relief with plasticine on paper. And I think there are two things there that are really important to understanding Tim. One is the idea of the twin soul, which he later felt he found in his marriage to Judith. And the appeal of the Tolkien books, of course, is the Fellowship of the Ring, the idea of a band of friends and companions setting off on their quest for the good. All his life, Tim really wanted to be part of a gang or group of artists. And during his time in Baroda, which I'm going to talk about later, he really felt he found that. And in his passionate support and belief in art and in artists, I think he really did become an inspiration to his many friends and students. After a conversation with Tim, you felt that your creative endeavor, whatever it was, had been validated. When the twins were 11, they had to take an exam, common entrance, to go to Charterhouse. Tony failed the exam, so the twins were separated, which was very traumatic for both of them. And Tim often said later that he thought that his talent had in a way peaked at that age, at 11, and that going off to boarding school felt like being sent to a concentration camp. And luckily, he already had a great gift for making and keeping friends. And I can see many people here today, Oliver and Chris, James and Dinah, who all became his friends during those years. Tim hated sport, but he was able to escape to the studio at Charterhouse, where he had a remarkable art teacher, Ian Fleming Williams, who became a lifelong mentor and friend. And then, when he was 17, he went to the Slade, where many of you here today knew him. Thank you. I'm just going to read now from a lovely tribute that was sent by his friends Gulammohammed Sheik and Nilima Sheik. And they are, in fact, the friends in Baroda who also spent 4 wonderful days with him in Florence last year. And you may have seen their very beautiful work at the recent Indian exhibition at the Barbican. Tim's gone. It's difficult to describe the surge of feelings rising up at the thought of Tim's departure. For months, I refused to believe he had gone. Then I kept wondering whether, if he had agreed to get an ambulance after the food poisoning episode, Wouldn't that have saved him? But no, he refused to get an ambulance and just slipped away from all of us. We last met in early August when we'd gone to see an exhibition together at Dulwich Picture Gallery and lingered over tea at the cafe there. We'd met earlier in March too, when my wife Nilima and I, with our son Kabir and artists' friends Atul and Andrew Dodia, had gathered in that glorious city of Florence for nearly 4 days. Tim had led us into Santa Maria Novella to see hidden episodes of murals only he had known about. How we had exclaimed together at the Ghirlandaio panels there and marveled at Masaccio's crucifixion, which was then under restoration. And yes, we also found our way into small-time pizza galleries and walked down the streets guzzling the famed Italian gelatos. Events after such events tumble out, which are stored in my memories of him. I remember several walks with Tim into the lanes of London. His descriptions of historical and anecdotal tales were always colourful and often laced with a little wicked aside. We met dozens of times in London, but also in Italy, including at sites of our shared pictorial pilgrimages like Siena, in Paris, and of course in India. When he came to India in the early 1980s, he became a part of the artistic community in Baroda. We'd traveled together to Jaisalmer, a medieval fortress city in Rajasthan, stayed in a private resort inside a byline in the interior of Ahmedabad. Beside fun and confidences shared with Bhupen Kaka, there would be an intense and long discussions of our residents on the state of contemporary art with the art critic Geeta Kapoor or her partner, artist Vivan Sundaram. Once he'd introduced the dictum of narrative painting that he was spiritually attached to, it gave a descriptive label for the art of Baroda. It was most of the time in the company of Judith, his inseparable partner, who, despite her developing disabilities, joined us nearly everywhere. Over the last few years, we've marveled at the Bruegelian companionship they had. We saw him broken after she passed on. And then he kept posting drawing after drawing of her on Instagram, odes to that mistress of incredible prose. Goodbye, my dear Tim. Where are you? Are you tickling the angels with your wicked humor? Are you listening? I'm sure you are. So thank you very much, Gulam and Nilima, for that lovely tribute. And now the writer, Gabriel Josipovici, is going to talk about his long friendship with Tim.
Thanks. Yes, I'm going to talk about Tim as a friend, but in a way, a lot of it has already been said. Friendship, C.S. Lewis once remarked, begins with the thought, what? You too? How wonderful. I thought I was the only one. Tim and I were friends for close on 50 years. And what initially brought us together and remained a guiding thread throughout that time was our shared love of medieval art and our shared sense that medieval art and culture could help us in our quest for a meaningful modern art. Not that we had any nostalgic notions of a lost medieval golden world, for we also found that we had both been profoundly influenced by that great work of cultural history, that quintessential product of the Warburg School, Klibanski, Panofsky, and Sachs, Saturn, and Melancholy. And both in our different ways recognized that we were the children of melancholy, and the inhabitants of a modern world. No, like many of the great modernist writers and painters we both admired, we simply felt that the great realist art that began with the Renaissance had in a sense run its course, and that other traditions, those of the Middle Ages, of India, of the Far East, excited and energized us far more. And we shared as well a refusal to bow to fashion, and a deep suspicion of the image of the artist as a sacred being, a genius above the petty conventions of ordinary men and women. That is why, though Tim paints himself frequently into his canvases, it is usually as a grotesque and clumsy figure, both ridiculous and admirable, Don Quixote. Deep friendships, I think, can tolerate profoundly antithetical views. There was a utopian side to Tim that I not only could not share, but found almost incomprehensible. He loved the novels of John Cooper Purse and the paintings of Stanley Spencer because he shared their beliefs. He really did hold with Blake that where others saw the sun as a round disk of fire, he saw it as an innumerable company of the heavenly hosts crying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty." My skeptical spirit couldn't follow him there, but I recognized it was a vital part of his makeup. And yet it coexisted in him with an equally profoundly held belief, which I shared, in Baudelaire's insistence that modernity is the transient, the fleeting, the contingent, the half of art whose other half is the eternal and the immutable. That certainly was what he sought to capture in his innumerable remarkable drawings of London life and in the majority of his canvases, and of course what he loved in Bonnard. Now, lasting friendship is built on shared experiences. Tim and Judith came on holiday with us to the Dolomites, and I remember sitting in the hotel garden one evening, both of us attempting to draw the mountain opposite with its dark patches of fir trees, and Tim patiently showing me how to try and catch the spirit of the whole rather than concentrate on detail. We visited Berlin together to see the great Kittai show at the Jewish Museum there, and took a week-long trip through Bavaria looking at its medieval art. The Germanisches Museum in Dürer's hometown of Nuremberg bowled us over. If London had just one of its rooms, Tim said, the English perception of medieval art would be wholly altered. The kind of grand remark he was so prone to, but which often encapsulated something very precisely true. In Würzburg, after seeing the Riemenschneiders, he was adamant that we walk down the hill and visit Giovanni Battista Tiepolo's painted ceiling above the staircase of the residence. Since I have an aversion to Baroque art, and the main claim to fame of this work, as far as I could see, was its size, the largest painted surface in the Western world, apparently, I had no great expectation. But coaxed by Tim to take my time, I gradually began to see how remarkable it was, and not just for its size. And that, I think, was Tim all over. His taste was strong but extremely Catholic. Good art of any kind filled him with joy. And that joy, of course, was infectious. The Tiepolo ceiling and the hour or more we spent looking at it have stayed with me all my life. He was the most generous and in some ways the kindest person I've ever known. Though he had strong likes and dislikes, he invariably saw the best in people and never seemed offended or envious. And he worked at friendship, I think, as is testified by the fact that you're so many of you here. He worked at friendship. When I first got to know him, he was planning a trip to Africa to visit an elderly friend from the poets' circle. "I've got to go and see him," he said. "He may not be with us much longer." And I told him once how frustrated I was by a friend who was making unreasonable demands on me, he gently rebuked me. Gabriel, there aren't many people we share important concerns with. We mustn't let little annoyances ever cloud that. And at the end, when he lost Judith, his muse and life partner for so many years, he went on looking forward with plans for new paintings and what would have been an important book on early medieval English illumination, the greatest art England has yet produced, he said, as well as a memoir which had reached his 35th year and his new life with Judith. I loved him for that, even as I saw the pain he was struggling with. A month or two ago, at the private view of a wonderful exhibition of drawings at the Town Gallery in Eastbourne, Tamara and I were looking at 2 drawings by Tim of Judith in her hospital bed. Beside us was a group of young women talking excitedly. "Were you taught by Tim?" I asked the one nearest to me. "Yes," she said, "we all were. He was the most wonderful and generous of tutors, and now he's gone." And she burst into tears. I tried to comfort her. "You just have to internalize all he gave you and pass it on to those who never knew him." I said, a banal enough remark, but nonetheless true. Those of us lucky enough to have known him, as well as his drawings and paintings, his books and articles, have the sound of his voice in our ears. It's not the same, of course, but at least we've been lucky enough to have known him. Thank you. David. David Smith is going to.
Is it all right, fine?
When I was asked to talk about Tim's world vision and key reference points, I was delighted. And then when it came to actually trying to put it down in 5 minutes, I thought, hang on a moment, this is a bit tricky. So there is much omitted. Film, many people in this room will know, was incredibly important to Tim. And surprisingly and interestingly, we had many discussions about music too, and that's not in this. So as Miranda said, he felt he'd peaked as an artist at 11. And he writes in the draft memoir, "Never again would I experience such a clean confidence in the making of images." And then last year, in something else entirely, he wrote, "I think it is evident to most thoughtful painters that the previous languages of careful representation had become threadbare and unusable. We are all beginning again." And he went on, "Most contemporary art is homeless, without any defined role in society, so utterly unlike Lorenzetti's integrated room at the heart of the city republic of Siena, an entire microcosm of their world." And he quoted a refugee from Beirut who spent some time with Tim and said to him, "You and your friends, you all paint like rather damaged children." As Miranda has already said, at Charterhouse, he had the great good fortune to be taught by and be befriended by Ian Fleming Williams. And I'm making some considered and careful use of Tim's draft writings in his memoir and elsewhere in what I'm about to say in the rest of this talk. It was through Fleming Williams that I first heard of Sienese painting, first saw Obonar. It was he who first put into my hands a novel by John Cooper Powys, and it was he who first asked me at 17 to deliver a full-scale lecture on Goya. These are still among the focal points of my life. Later would come Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities. And as Gabriel has said, there was the discovery of Panofsky et al.'s Saturn and Melancholy. My whole brain exploding in overload. Some of those medieval texts delivered such a spasm of recognition as to change my life forever. Some 35 years after first encountering Bonnard, Tim wrote in A New Space for the Self, through the subjectivity of Bonnard's wide open space, we are shocked out of the narrowness of our normal seeing, overwhelmed anew by the power and beauty of the visible, and shown how the creation of space in painting is a way of articulating the self and making it visible. Nevertheless, it was, he says, not art history, but narrative fiction that really touched the core of my experience. An entry into my most urgent human concerns, hovering above me, carried over into every episode of my existence, was the enormous question, how shall I live my life? And Poes was central. More than any painter, Poes shaped me. My conception of an ideal picture, it would need to be large and complex, fluid enough to accommodate just everything, as Poes wrote of a Glastonbury romance, combining the mythical and allegorical with the most minutely observed depiction of everyday life. It would be panoramic, map-like, yet within this aerial view, human figures would loom large, individuals with their share of the grotesque. The picture would contain within itself a cyclic rhythm with enchantment and disenchantment present together. In one of his last pieces, written for Noah Satterstrom's 2023 exhibition catalogue, Tim wrote about Ambrogio's perspectival space, where we're both above and inside the city. We see everything, yet we are also able to participate and move freely about. Near and far can be simultaneously present, a kind of seeing truer to our imaginative experience of space, as confirmed in reverie and dream than ever possible in single point perspective. And significantly, I think he went on, here it may also take on an ethical dimension, embodying the fluidity and social diversity of the libertarian ideal. The effect is of our loosely hovering over the territory, passing from one focus to another, invited to take our journey. I do not yet feel able or ready to speak about the significance of Judith in Tim's life, their love, a marriage in 1982, which he always said was transformative, completely unexpected and fundamental. She, as we all know, was his muse and closest companion. And in late March of 2023, Tim posted a photo taken at Angel. We've lived here 34 years. Judith has had Parkinson's for 25 of them. We are both suddenly aware that we're heading towards being elderly or even dead. And after Judith's death that September, Tim drew her again and again, him as an earthbound supplicant reaching up to her. In late April 2021, during the first lockdown, which seems itself now like something out of a dream, I emailed Tim a clip from Dorothy Richardson's The Tunnel, chapter 4 of her The Pilgrimage. And Tim replied, wonderful passage, which I hadn't truly noticed in my general delight in the tunnel. And it seems apposite to end with this. All the real part of your life has a real dream in it. Some of the real dream, part of you coming true. You know in advance when you are really following your life. These things are familiar because reality is here. Coming events cast light. It's like dropping everything and walking backwards to something you know is there. However far you go out, you come back. I am back now where I was before I began trying to do things like other people. I left home to get here. I'm going to hand over now to Paul Hills to talk about art and art history.
I'm going to speak about just one book of Tim's and give over my short paper mostly to Tim's words. When Tim asked me sometime in 2001 to read the draft of his book on Sienese painting, I anticipated an account that would be personal, passionate, and illuminated by a painter's brilliant observations of individual paintings. What I soon discovered was also a work of compelling scholarship. Tim didn't skimp on his research. He had a nose for the best writers, among them Meyer Shapiro on Romanesque, Erich Auerbach on Dante and St. Francis, Yves Borsuk on Tuscan art. It was Borsuk who, in 2003 at Villa Itati, the Harvard Center for Renaissance Studies, remarked that Hyman's was the best book ever written on Sienese art. Quite a tribute from a veteran scholar. Already knowing the story he wanted to tell, Tim took what he needed from academic art historians, cut to the quick, and ditched the dross, which there's usually rather a lot. The opening paragraph of the introduction, entitled An Art Born Amid City Streets, is a launch pad, inviting us both to explore the city and to take flight. I quote, "Above the gate, inside the wall, below the towered hills, across the chessboard expanse of fields, towards the curving horizon." Any account of Sienese painting will be full of spatial indications. No other art had engaged so imaginatively with the experience of moving about in one's own city, of hovering above it, of surveying the panoramic landscape beyond. In no other painting tradition do we find architecture represented with such tender intimacy, figures juxtaposed against the deep space of street or interior with such freshness of compositional invention. Tim's narrative moves between these two poles, the panoramic and even cosmic sweep, and the tender intimacy of miracles unfolding on Sienna's streets. Reading the book now, after Tim's death, his response to the tenderness in Sienese art is especially moving. Of Duccio's Maesta, or Virgin in Majesty, he observes, "All around the throne, the angel's tender laying on of hands frames the central hand play of mother and child." Well, nowhere in the academic literature will you find such sensitivity to the laying on of hands, a painter's awareness of the touch of the brush. And again, bringing us up close to Ambrogio Lorenzetti's panoramic fresco of the well-governed city, he remarks, "No preliminary design could have anticipated the constant play of the calligraphic mark across the enormous surface, the wisps of vegetation, the percussion of the cornfield stubble, the featheriness of a cockerel's multicolored tail. Even after so much damage, it survives as one of the greatest touch paintings in European art." Well, there's no time to do justice to the thrilling way Tim leaps across the centuries in his Siena book, as indeed in all his books, often uniting the political and the pictorial, as here when he describes the ring of dancers at the center of Lorenzetti's well-governed city. I quote, "The significance of their dance is surely a kind of distillation of peace. For Ambrogio, as later for Matisse, when human beings move together in a circle, they spell out a fundamental image of social well-being, the dolce vita e riposata, the bonheur de vivre that follows from communal freedom and justice." It is terribly sad that Tim did not live to see the exhibition of Sienese painting that opened last autumn in the Met to 5-star reviews and arrives at the National Gallery this March. The catalogue is a work of impeccable scholarship, yet it quite fails to explain why Sienese painting might excite us today. Tim, of course, was uniquely qualified to do just that, and yet absurdly, scandalously, he was never invited, and the exhibition was a long 10 years in the planning. So instead, we must read his book, the book that concludes so poignantly, so daringly, with the words, "These are the pictures that have moved me most, jolting me into a wonder I have felt impelled to share. The good news, long lost, now found again." The next speaker is Kathryn Maple.
Thanks. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Wow. I did wonder if we might have to hire St. Paul's, but all the more special to have it here at the Royal Academy, as it was such a special place for Tim. And indeed, my only time of getting into the summer exhibition was the room he curated in 2019, so thanks, Tim. I was fortunate to have met Tim just 10 years ago as a student at the Royal Drawing School. I had managed to get a place on the National Gallery and Drawing in the Cities class. This was not an easy feat, as these classes always booked up fast, often with double waiting lists. My memories will always be strong, as I'm sure are the hundreds of other artists that were lucky enough to have been in touch with Tim. His knowing eye and all the quotes he used never tire. A favourite of mine from Tim was from Delacroix, out with his students, pointing up to a high building. And Tim often sort of adapted a slightly American voice when he would say this. "If you haven't sufficient skill to make a sketch of that man throwing himself out of the window in the time it takes him to fall from the 4th floor to the ground, you will never be capable of producing grand machines." I keep hearing it all the time. Whether out and about in the city or in my studio, I often find myself wondering, what would Tim think? When I think of Tim's work, I follow his line, which is always searching. I find myself being guided around London, on the curb at a busy crossing with buses and bikes in steady flow, amongst the market sellers at Ridley Road, or at the top of Christchurch Spitalfields. We could be observing friends gossiping in a cafe, or people squashed on a tube. I also find myself flying over London, following the Thames, taking in the bridges, aeroplanes and movements of the cranes. This unmasked city, where I become exposed to its wholeness, activated at once by many intersecting marks. Tim's line is strong. Marks put down as dashes or dots, a frenzied group of pigeons, an exchange outside a betting shop. Marks are seen scurrying across the whole surface, tracking someone's movements around a park, or people lounging and working inside the National Gallery, Theatre or Barbican, places he enjoyed drawing. There is so much to enjoy. In both his drawings and paintings, often an inescapable urgency to get something down, for it not to be missed. A strong wit ran through all of Tim's work, a woman's nose taking on some froth from a cappuccino, or late night clubbers sitting on the curb. Tim's drawings somehow go further, to give movement in real time, and a reminder of what it is to be fully present. And what about all of the bags Tim brought with him? I will never forget the remarkably large amount he would arrive with at the beginning of his class. These filled with books, some known and others new. I think a record was probably 7, but then in the 7th, there would be an 8th. What I found so special about his work was Tim's ability to put these references aside, always taking in and reflecting on what he observed. We spoke often about the city as an immersive theatre of life, and his paintings are reflective of this. Tim's ability to deepen my own thoughts, even if they often came out as a scrambly mess, were always worked through. There are painter friends and tutors that you can pretty much tell what response you'll get from a particular piece. But with Tim, you never quite knew. Sometimes frustration, puzzlement, exasperation, that I probably peaked at 7 or 11, as we've been hearing, but often encouragement. And then absolutely nailing the one useful word you've been searching for weeks. One guarantee was that anything said was always unedited and from the heart. Tim's ability to let things play out in his paintings I often admired. Much like a collage, objects and people would appear driving the narrative and then as quickly could be painted over and taken out. Through his vivid image making, his paintings offer accessibility, the often chaotic energies of domestic life, and people that we can instantly identify with, along with the pull from all of his writing and imagery that he archives so carefully at home in his studio. These ideas and memories catalogued in loose leaf files, I think you still call them that, I believe were entitled Emblems, which I think he was in his 12th volume, and are all fruitful treasures offering much insight into his thinking and his enjoyment of all kinds of imagery. Another strong memory comes from a painting trip to Tuscany with the drawing school. Tim had brought along several copies of his limited edition of 300 Concertina book in memory of Bupin Kakar 2009. Within minutes, a whole queue had formed and sales were being made. This treasured book, one of which I'm lucky to own, is a real feast for the eye. Tim's ability to bring the outside in, creating a visual language which is at once playful and deeply felt, I hugely admired. The colours on each page work as individuals, and then gaining something even more special as you scroll through, a kind of guilty pleasure. This particular book also comes with that gentle nudge to say that something small can be special too. Tim always made the effort to show up and would attend as many private views and meetups as he could. He always wanted to be kept in the know and maintained such strong relationships. I would just love to end with briefly telling you about a trip that Tim made to Liverpool to see my John Moore show in 2021. Tim, boosted by the allure of a one-night stay at the Adelphi Hotel, described on one TripAdvisor review as a total shambles, and another, "Don't go there, man." I quickly realised that if Tim didn't think too much about my new paintings, at least there would be a strong memory in there somewhere. Just looking up and seeing him there made me feel happy and somewhat reassured. Tim fully embraced the night and continued on drinking cocktails into the early hours. And this was yet another example of Tim's total enthusiasm for life and art. He was a huge support to so many artists and a friend that will be hugely missed.
Thank you, Kathryn, and thank you everybody who's spoken so vividly. We have 3 or 4 more contributions, people speaking from the floor. The first is Maliki, who's over there. Nicky Hyman, Tim's elder brother, very much wanted to be here, but unfortunately he's not well enough to make it. But he has written down what he wanted to say, and Maliki is going to read it for us now. Maliki.
Thank you. So I'm speaking on behalf of my grandfather, Nicholas Hyman. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to make it today. So a few brief words. Timmy wrote a revealing obituary of Ian Fleming Williams in 1996. As a young teenager, he blossomed in Ian's studios at Charterhouse, where he was introduced to Ravenna, Venice, Capri, and Rhineland. These formative journeys were guided by Alan Hyman, and they deeply influenced his artistic and intellectual growth. Timmy also wrote about the life in Steyning, Sussex, in the London Magazine. This opportunity came through Alan Ross, the editor with whom Timmy shared a strong affinity. He also spent a period in Lincoln, near the Cathedral Close, which I believe particularly congenial to him. In 2024, he returned a painting of the Lord Lieutenant of Lincoln, resource that, to me, evoked a fading sense of hierarchy, a theme Timmy often captured with his subtlety. Oliver Probyn, who was initially a Carthusian friend, designed a small summer house in Steyning, adjacent to Timmy's studio, and born the conversation. It was a favorite spot for Alan Hyman to sit and reflect. Timmy loved living in Steyning, but also had a deep connection to Soho, particularly the Berwick Street area. Before moving to Soho, Timmy also only drank wine abroad, but his time there transformed his habits and perhaps even his outlook. He gently disapproved of Chelsea and Belgravia, where much of his childhood had been spent, preferring the vibrancy of Soho. He remained especially fond of the Algerian coffee stores in Old Compton Street. Roger Farrington, in connection with the Working Men's College of Crowndale Road, helped maintain Timmy's link to the city during his time in Steyning. Many of you may be familiar with his group portrait Roger commissioned, which is now part of the college collection. As Marlena Dietrich once sang about Puff, Puff, Magic Dragon, Timmy's paintings, drawings, and writings will live on forever. His creative legacy continues and inspires and enriches all who encounter it. Thank you.
And now Roger Malbert is going to say a few words.
Thank you. I want to talk about Tim's activities as a curator of exhibitions, about one in particular. I didn't see narrative paintings, which was at the ICA and elsewhere in 1979. I got to know Tim and we became friends in the late 90s when we collaborated on an exhibition called Carnivalesque. We immediately agreed on the chief protagonists of this alternative canon, anti-classical canon of art, and starting, of course, with Bruegel, Goya, James Gilray, Max Beckmann, Ensor, and among contemporary artists, Paul McCarthy and Lee Bowery. We derived our theoretical framework from the great Russian literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin, whose study of medieval humor, Rabelais and his world, was an inspiration to both of us. We took from him our conceptual categories, 4 categories, which were the world turned upside down, the grotesque body, the comic mask, and the tumultuous crowd. All of those, of course, can be found in Tim's own work. And that, in a way, was the point. Tim was strongly partisan, and he followed his own instinct, and in a way, his single-minded adherence to this one true path, as he saw it. There was an element of solipsism in that, of course, but it also made for a very strong exhibition, where every work was chosen with conviction. And Tim could have written about any single work at great length and with lucidity. writing and curating were on a continuum. Rereading his catalogue for that exhibition, I was struck by the depth of his knowledge of art and the depth of his insights, all expressed with powerful and beautiful prose. He concluded that essay with a line which I'm going to finish with now, praising the victory of laughter over fear. Thank you.
And now Sandy Moffat will speak.
We first met in the spring of 1977 in the house of Peter de Francia. The doorbell rang, and in walked this thin, bespectacled, rather gawky young man who immediately started firing all sorts of questions and quizzed us. De Francia leant forward and said, "This is Timothy Hyman." So that's how we met. Then on the way back from de Francia's house to the underground, we got talking and we established common ground almost immediately. De Francia, Kittai, Beckman. I'd already shown all these artists, all three of those artists in Edinburgh, so there were a lot to discuss, a lot to get our teeth into. So that was the beginning of a lifelong friendship. I guessed and grasped, actually, that Tim was a man who asked questions of painting, questions ignored by many, but questions that had to be faced. One of his favorites, of course, in those days was, what has gone wrong with our art? Who else asked that question in 1978, 1979? Of course, his enthusiasms certainly broadened my horizons. Domenico Tiepolo, Siena, for example, contemporary Indian painting, all these things, and of course his love of the big city, of London, of Paris, of even Edinburgh. He always urged me, why don't you do more paintings of Edinburgh? Get out and draw, get out and paint the city, for goodness sake. Yep. So his visits to Scotland were numerous. I mean, I think he first came in 1978 to stay during the festival. He established contact with the printmaker's workshop, started etching. He had a sojourn for several months to one of the Orkney Islands with Judith. To cleanse myself from London, he announced. Yes. And then, of course, when I was in Glasgow, I invited him to lecture and talk on many, many occasions. His customary balancing act, there would be a lecture on an old master, let's say Bruegel. And then the next lecture would be on a modern, Bonnard, for example. So he was able to compare, as it were, and contrast Bruegel's narratives with Bonnard's touch. These were provocative and stimulating lectures, which the students absolutely, not only did they love, but they gained a great deal from, because no one else was really talking about painting the way that Tim did. He illuminated everything. Also, I think, well, possibly about 10 years ago now, when he was the artist in residence, Maggie Centres, we went to Dundee together to the Frank Gehry building, Kirkcaldy, the Zaha Hadid building. These would be an artist in residence in a Maggie Centre isn't an easy task, but he did it with, not only with flair, but that sensitivity, that understanding that he was surrounded by people who, some of them were actually going to die. So that had to be done with a light touch, but a sure hand as well. And I think in the Maggies, Tim's humanity really came to the fore. A couple of little personal notes to end with. I was present at the wedding reception in 1982. He had a long and lasting and rewarding relationship with Judith. Her loss was very keenly felt. And the final message on the 29th of August. We're getting a big Siena show at the National Gallery next March. So let's plan to see that together if we don't manage something before. Inevitably confronting mortality now, having to rewrite my will, and too many skulls and skeletons making their appearance in my art. Yet a fertile and productive and fortunate time also. Thank you, Tim, and thank you as well.
Finally, Paul Becker.
Keep thinking I'm going to see Tim. I don't know if any of you have that. Thinking I'm going to turn around and there he's going to be Jeffrey Camp and Andy Stahl, a lot of the painters we've lost. Tim, in one of our first meetings, quoted me the title of a short story by the great Ukrainian writer Isaac Babel. I still have it written in block capitals in the back of an old sketchbook next to where Tim had also noted I should watch Rossellini's Francis Gesture of God and look at the Sacetta in the National Gallery. The Bible title is You Must Know Everything. And really, Tim, what phrase in speaking of you could be more apt? There's always something particularly sad about a good painter dying, always a thought of more business to be done. The cutting short of a body of work, Tim was on a roll when he died, but perhaps even more sad than the cessation of the work is the disappearance of Tim's incredible depth of painting knowledge, which we'd heard a lot about, his broad reach, his profoundly radical, anarchic, deeply generous, pan-cultural vision. The painter intellectual, unfazed, undaunted by theory, in love with the wonder of film, the wilder shores of literary fiction. Tim wrote about painting as a painter. He had skin in the game, so the writing was never bloodless, loveless, distant, or unemotional, as art history can so often disappointingly be. Reverberating through all he wrote lay a quiet but insistent call to pick up one's brush and enter the fray. Tim was combative, refusing to accept the orthodoxies that came in the wake of new developments in art making, or indeed the reactionary nature of some traditional painting. He was temperamentally opposed to the idea of F studios, but never has there been a more unswerving advocate for drawing. Tim was not interested so much in the primacy of anything, more the availability of everything. Plurality was part of his DNA, because there must be room for us all. And the weirder the better. Students, young artists working in the margins always made a beeline for Tim, because he was of their number. His heart open, his eye intrinsically, joyfully perverse. His was a vision that set the Anglo-Saxon, the pre-Renaissance, the medieval, early Chagall, Bonnard, Charlotte Solomon at the same temporal level and the same level of importance as the present. It seems to me that what he was always arguing for with such commitment and such love were ways of making and thinking that have always been with us, but for much of Tim's lifetime were overlooked and marginalized, but which have now become available to artists, as I believe he anticipated they would. I'll list some. The dream, the narrative, the subjective, the naive, the observational, the visionary, the emotional, the sexual, the personal, the queer, the microcosmic, the feminine, the spiritual. To those who got him, Tim stayed incredibly, doggedly loyal and listened and looked carefully and always, always critically. Tim was a courageous, relentless fighter for artists to exist in their own ways, beyond stricture, beyond prescription. Otherwise, what is the point? Like Judith before him, he was wholly unprecedented and completely irreplaceable. Thank you.
We have one more item. It's a poem written for today, I think, by Tim's friend Arvind Mehrotra. He and Arvind met when Tim first went to India in the late 70s, and they've maintained a friendship for the rest of their lives. They would meet whenever Tim went back to India and whenever Arvind came over here. And this poem is about a painting that Tim made, a family portrait of Arvind, his wife, and his young son during his first visit to India. And it's called The Red Table. The canvas panel is now on our wall, a family group round a low red table, squares painted on it, bandana's design. It could have come from Omega workshops. In the foreground, Tim's crossed legs and his palette, he himself not in the picture. Age, with its bag of stents and valves, waits off stage. Our son, then 4, is bent over his drawing book, smudging it. In the distance, a railway line and a locomotive. I've forgotten the morning he made the painting, but not the day in 1983 he carried it back from Antony Blonde and gave it to me. We'd gone there together. Not much had sold. In an email he wrote, "If we survive long enough, we find ourselves part of history, at least. Citations, mentions in dispatches, etc." Where was the hurry, Tim? In a measureless world, art makes a small circle. Thank you, Arvind. Lovely poem. Thank you, everybody who's spoken today. You've really conjured him up for us. It's been terrific. Thank you. Our thanks to the RA for allowing us to have these rooms. In particular, our thanks to Alex Collini and Emmanuel Ramos, who held our hands as we prepared for this event and did so with great tact and sensitivity, so thank you. We have these rooms till 1 o'clock, so do please stay. There are refreshments, tea and coffee in the next room, and in the far room, cakes and Prosecco. Tim loved cakes. So do please have a cake and raise a glass to him before you go. Thank you very much.